9 to 5 is such a core part of our lives that we have songs written about it.
Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living.
But how did we end up with the 40-hour work week? When did the weekend become a thing? And is there any hope of improving on that schedule? And no, the answer isn't Ford Motor Company. In fact, most of the progress happened well before the automobile was even invented. It was not one singular event or law that created either the 40-hour week or the 8-hour day. But there are some very notable ones which had effects that spread well outside of these borders. The daily limits, however, were truly the first fight. If we look back at the 18th century, there are no standards, which is understandable considering that the Industrial Revolution has not shifted the common work times just yet. Hours varied by season, not just because of farming, but because of natural light. 14-hour days might be an option in the summer, but it's difficult and expensive to work by candlelight in many trades. And that was the employment of most people, some sort of hands-on trade that operated in shops from 1 to easily 100 people. I've previously spent years working in buildings with no electric lights and just windows to cling to on cloudy days. In winter, you try to make up for it by cleaning up around the shop, doing paperwork, but genuinely, they partied a lot. Holidays were much more common, with up to 50 days a year at one point. Even by the late 18th century, things like Christmas truly were that day and the 11 following at the least. Sundays off were still relatively standard, and though Saint Mondays were falling out of favor, they weren't unheard of yet. So while we didn't call them weekends, the 2 days of rest did exist at one point before regulations. While they may have been working around 10 hours a day on average, the annual hours add up to a very similar number to our own today. Things were changing, however, and our time was about to be increasingly spent at work, which we know is not the ideal balance for our health, physical or mental. And that's a pretty big part of the discussion today, which is why I'm so happy that the sponsor for this week's video is Grow Therapy. I'm going through a lot of shifts in my life right now and trying to find my feet. It's not all bad things, but it's a lot to handle on my own. I've returned to therapy throughout my life in moments when I'm overwhelmed, struggling, or trying to find a healthy way to, well, grow. But it's not always simple to find a therapist that works for my specific needs and schedule. Grow makes therapy more accessible and more personalized. You can filter your search by identity, age, gender, and so much more to find someone who will actually understand the things you're dealing with. I just signed up for an appointment last week and put in my whole range of requirements and still ended up with a list of really great options. Each has reviews as well as a bio to let you know how they approach discussions, which really helped me choose because sometimes people need a gentle hand. Others need things to be straightforward. It's not an easy task when you're already dealing with too much. Grow gives you control over your choices and schedule. And they work with over 125 insurance plans, and you pay per session, so you aren't paying a subscription fee you'll have to handle later. We all need a little extra support from time to time to help us figure things out. To learn more about Grow Therapy, head to the link in my description or scan the QR code on screen for a quicker way to get support. Now, there is an increase in working hours over the 18th century, even before our manufacturing systems really changed. What exactly caused this has been heavily debated, but I at least support the theory that it's the accessibility to fashionable goods increasing, both through international trade bringing more things to local shops, but also more and more things being mass-produced and needing to be made less expensive. It creates an entire ecosystem of even more mass production, well before machines, meaning lower pay, but also cheaper goods, international trade increasing and speeding up, which also brings cheaper goods, which both encourages people to buy more, therefore work longer to make more money to afford that, but also sets up the issues of lower quality goods not being passed down and lasting for generations. You have to buy more, even if you avoid trendy things. We know this was part of what fed working hours later in the 20th century, and still today, and what we often still blame on the consumers and workers instead of the system and manufacturers. Why do we buy so much stuff? Not just because we can afford to, barely, but because it feels like the things are always falling apart. Or we find out that cheap plastic cookware we've had for 10 years is releasing hazardous chemicals into our food. We have to buy new ones. You know, reasons. I've talked about this before if you want to understand that annoying cycle of quality and implied morality as well. The point still stands, though, that for most of those people, increasing their working hours, maybe starting to work on Mondays or even Sundays, they had that choice. Or the master of their shop made the choice and could be directly argued with. Most were paid by how much they produced or hours they worked, so an increase at least meant more pay. Schedules weren't a standard, they likely weren't a consistent thing year round, and certainly didn't have precise clocking in and out mechanisms. What the Industrial Revolution did with this was to add on a whole new level of productivity that the owners demanded from the workers, along with the technology to regulate it. As manufacturers bought expensive machines, they wanted to get a return on that investment. Employees were no longer highly trained tradespeople, but took a couple hours to be a body operating a lever. Every hour the machine wasn't being operated, it wasn't making that money back. The human input wasn't valuable in the same way. Longer hours and night shifts kept things operating around the clock. It was better to have people work longer than more employees, since the things like shift overturn, training, and benefits added up in the immediate calculations of profits. So, what happened? Well, this is going to be a lot of information condensed down to some really important key moments. So, yes, I'm going to skip some things because, frankly, the Haymarket Affair is more influential than another amendment to a 1930s bill, which means we get to cover some things they rarely do in school, but really should because they're incredibly interesting and completely reshaped our daily lives. This journey didn't start with big corporations or magnanimous millionaires. It would be the major cities with specific industries focused in them that would have the first discussions over regulating hours. The carpenters in Philadelphia went on strike in 1791 for 10-hour days. This spread to larger citywide strikes in 1835. Robert Owen, a Welsh labor activist, was one of the first to push for 8-hour days. He was actually the one who developed the concept of 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of recreation, or what you will, all the way back in 1811. The 1860s saw national level events like the Chicago labor movement and Congress passing an 8-hour day for federal employees in 1868. That law almost immediately crumbled, not because President Andrew Johnson vetoed it, they managed to pass it anyway, but because wages were promptly cut by 20% to adjust for that. President Grant added a law in 1869 that kept federal daily pay the same, regardless of hours, so that wouldn't happen again. 8-hour leagues popped up in many major cities over the following years. The decades after the Civil War created what is now known as the Long Depression, from 1873 to 1879, or really more like 1899, depending on who you ask. It originally was known as the Great Depression before that title was awarded to the next one. Industrial centers regularly saw strikes and rallies to improve working conditions and pay during that time. There was a lot of unrest. Chicago was one of the most active, with a large German immigrant population that was being paid extremely little, around $1.50, and working 6 10-hour days a week. These efforts had been met with the standard range of anti-union responses: blacklisting, locking out, recruiting, strikebreakers, and thugs, as well as trying to use ethnic tensions and anti-immigration emotions to cause division. Yes, even with German immigrants. This isn't a new thing. By the 1880s, groups had organized and set forward their demands with a massive backing on implementing 8-hour days. Not surprisingly, there was no active response from employers. On May 1st in 1886, Chicago held an 80,000 person rally to call for a strike. The next day, over 350,000 workers around the nation joined in. On May 3rd, a rally at McCormick Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago turned violent as strikebreakers got off work and attempted to leave through the crowd. 2 demonstrators were killed, with multiple injured. The next day, another rally was held at the Haymarket Square as a response. Originally, the flyers called for workers to come armed, but one of the main speakers, August Spies, refused to attend under that condition. They reprinted the flyers, and the rally started quietly with speeches by multiple leaders that lasted for a few hours. However, around 10:30, as the last speaker was wrapping up, the police arrived to break things up. Despite insistence that the gathering was calm and lawful, by that point even the mayor had deemed it unconcerning and left. The police continued to push. As a response, someone threw a homemade fragmentation device into the approaching group. A dozen officers were killed, and at least 4 civilians. Reports in newspapers range closer to 50 civilians dead and injured, but many did not want to go to seek medical care for obvious reasons. Most of these deaths and injuries, however, came from the subsequent gunfire response from the police. Only one, I believe, was actually shown to be because of the fragmentation device. While 8 people eventually were arrested and charged, only 2 were actually there that day: August Spies and A.R. Parsons, who both were speakers, and at the time of the explosion were walking down the stairs off of the stage. None of them threw the bomb, but were assumed to have made and provided it, since they were part of an anarchist group who had printed the flyers for the rally and had a pretty popular newspaper. The trial was absolute chaos, as the judge was apparently extremely prejudiced against the defendants. It took over 1,000 potential jurors to find 12 that were not sympathetic in some way to the cause. All but one of the defendants were sentenced to death. The other received 15 years. The prosecution said it didn't matter that most had not built or dealt with the bomb in any way, potentially had no knowledge of it, simply because they had not done enough to discourage that type of response. They were pardoned 7 years later, but 4 had already been hanged, including Spies and Parsons, and another committed suicide in prison, the one who was likely the actual person that built the bomb. While there was a massive rise in anti-immigrant and anti-anarchist sentiment immediately following the event, as things settled down, the group became known as martyrs for the labor movements around the world. In 1890, the first International Workers' Day was celebrated on May 1st to honor the Haymarket Affair and was immensely successful. Referred to soon after as May Day, also a reference to May Day as the holiday, which is already on May 1st, it has become the standard Labor Day for many countries. As for the American Labor Day, no one can really verify exactly why we have it on a different day. There's multiple stories, but frankly, May 1st would make more sense. As unions became a standard of modern industrial production, more and more groups successfully won 8-hour days. Ford Motor Company is often credited with starting the trend for 8-hour days, but that didn't occur until 1914. They mostly moved down from 9 hours and found that it actually increased the profit margins. For Ford, this was as much a publicity matter as it was a social and economics experiment in hopes that it would help with quality, turnover, and most essential, employee unrest leading to stoppages and strikes, which was becoming an increasing problem for many, many other automakers. This change from $2 for a 9-hour day to $5 for an 8-hour day wasn't given to everyone, though. just men over 22 who had worked there for more than 6 months, and went through the new sociological department headed up by a minister to decide who was a good citizen and deserved it. Essentially, did they keep a clean, healthy home, avoid drink and other vices, and invest their money wisely? 90% that applied did receive the new benefits, so it wasn't absurdly strict. Not surprisingly, the results of this were visible in efficiency, the quality of new employees, worker happiness that led to higher quality products, and even suggestions from the employees on how to improve the system even further now that they were actually invested in the company. The success of Ford's schedule definitely helped other unions and workers argue for similar benefits, but it wasn't the first by a long shot. If anything, World War I actually had a larger impact on daily work time as outputs were kept track of closely. They found that after 8 hours, the effectiveness of employees started dropping in a way that statistically negated the benefits of keeping them working longer. Longer hours did not lead to proportional growth in output, which pretty well destroyed a lot of the arguments that manufacturers were making for longer days. The Russian Revolution also inspired countless pro worker groups around the world, and when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, it created the International Labor Office. Their first focus in their original meeting in 1919 was the 8 hour day. Of course, even with 8 hour days, it was still commonly a 6 day week. At this point, the US was mostly depending on individual industries to regulate themselves, which fell to union efforts. What finally pushed it over the edge was the Great Depression. Unemployment rates were outrageously high, and pay for those who worked was low. In 1933, the National Recovery Administration was created to set up codes of fair practice and set prices. It would include minimum wages, maximum hours, and minimum prices for products. Undercutting had reached a point where it was affecting decent businesses. Like fast fashion imports using terrible labor practices to make things incredibly cheaply or something. It was not a mandatory set of regulations, however, but businesses would voluntarily join and display the Blue Eagle to show their support. Theoretically, that meant they were following the standards, but that wasn't really checked up on effectively. However, many people began to boycott businesses that did not display the sign, which drove more to participate. That was the actual goal of the administration. It was intended to expire in 1935, but was also declared unconstitutional that year, so they didn't have a choice in re-upping it. The issues came down to overreach by the federal government into what many felt were state or local decisions. While the NRA had begun with a lot of support from both industries and workers, it fell apart as the rules were not well laid out, contradictory, required extreme oversight and fines, and was generally more focused on the idea of fair competition than workers' rights. A lot of it came down to who was in charge. The general consensus was that it was pretty well doomed from the start, regardless. That was the case with many of the policies put forward in the early 1930s. They didn't stick around for long. President Roosevelt, however, did not give up on that part of his New Deal. Ideally, regulation would not only directly benefit the individual worker, but would encourage employment of more people and business growth. And though the NRA had failed, it had brought together major industries and helped to form more powerful unions that could come up with a better plan. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was meant to do what the NRA could not. It created minimum wage, overtime pay at 1.5 times regular, and limited child labor, intentionally avoiding the pricing issues of the NRA. While it covered far more workers than just one or two union efforts did, it was still only about 20% of the workforce. These regulations did not include salary employees, businesses that did not operate in multiple states, service industries, businesses with less than 20 employees, most railmen, fishermen, salesmen, or agriculture workers, or government employees for that matter, which covers everything from politicians to police to sanitation workers. Some of those were left up to the states to decide since they weren't broad enough to include multiple states and therefore not a federal decision. Minimum wage was first set at 40 cents an hour, something that would actually affect around 700,000 workers. Overtime was implemented with a 44-hour week as standard to be lowered to 40 hours by 1940. Notably, the early versions actually averaged that across the year. That way, some seasonal adjustments could be made for certain industries. 32 hours during slow times compared to 48 during busy ones. Child labor was surprisingly still an ongoing issue in the 1930s, less so employing 6-year-olds to do repairs on manufacturing lines like the 19th century had, but in that many teenagers dropped out of school to just go work. They were usually paid much lower wages, which drug down adult wages and obviously also stunted their education. The very generalized set of rules was that hazardous jobs required an age of 18, non-hazardous 16, and at 14 and under, there are various rules about hours outside of school time, whether it's family employment, agriculture, delivering newspapers, film industry, etc. Everything is a little bit different. Pushing this bill through was not simple. The Supreme Court had ruled in similar situations just a few years before that the government did not have the reach to ban child labor made goods. However, a recent decision had opened up the possibility of broad labor laws where they ruled that any industry which moved raw or finished product through interstate traffic could be legislated by Congress. Public opinion on the bill was also split. Some claimed it was one step away from fascism or communism, whichever they felt like putting in. Others praised it for potentially destroying the curse of poverty. Many were still concerned it would be another NRA with a little too much overreach. And everyone agreed the logistics were going to be a nightmare. The South was particularly against it. Many areas were struggling with extreme poverty, largely found in agricultural regions that were not set up to thrive without slavery. Industry had started to move that direction because they could pay next to nothing compared to northern cities. No one in major industrial areas would accept $5 a week. Remember, Ford was paying $5 a day 20 years earlier, but those in the South would accept that. This bill meant the advantage of moving manufacturing to the South would end. For this reason, it barely cleared the Senate. The House actually adjusted it from 40 hours and 40 cents to 35 hours and 70 cents. Panic ensued. The original bill was brought back, which does make me wonder if that was almost intentional to make it seem a little more reasonable. Some further adjustments were made to the child labor section as well, and in the end, it passed. Numerous add-ons to the 1938 Act have been made over the decades. Many were just to clarify concepts. In 1947, they further defined what working hours actually were, for example. In 1949, they clarified the regular rate of pay and raised minimum wage to 75 cents. I'm not going to cover every increase in minimum wage because, frankly, that deserves its own entire video looking at how that compares to cost of living. But major moments occurred in 1963 with the Equal Pay Act, no difference in wages based on sex. 1974 amendments added domestic workers. 1983 added protections for migrant and seasonal agricultural workers. 1985 closed a loophole of employers offering paid time off instead of overtime. However, 1986 stripped protections from disabled workers so employers could pay them less than minimum wage, and in 1996, tipped employees were separated out from overall minimum wage increases. The last two changes to the bill were in 2010 to allow nursing mothers a space at work, and in 2019 they changed who qualified as the professional exempt group. Now they had to earn at least $35,568 a year to be bumped out of the safety net of overtime, but anyone making $107,432 is a highly compensated employee that no longer requires overtime protections. Doesn't mean you can't, it's just your company is not required to. The federal minimum wage has not been updated since 2007. Obviously, we are still sitting at that 40-hour week that we achieved in 1940 as well. With the addition of digital aspects, worker productivity has sharply risen and continues to improve every year. Companies make more off of every employee, just like the shift that happened when we introduced machinery. I've talked at length about how there was an expectation back in the 1950s that the working week would continue to decrease in hours. Even they thought that we'd be efficient enough to maybe need 20 hours per person, well before the power of computers was actually comprehensible by the average person. There are regular attempts at bills to reduce that number, the most recent being 2024 with Bernie Sanders putting forward a 32-hour week that we would gradually reduce to. Still using the 8-hour days that seem to be effective, but only 4 days a week, which, when you think about the number of hours we now add on to our jobs unpaid with travel and off hours communications, cell phones are great, would really just bring us back to actually having the needed weekly time to manage basic life. 8 hours of sleep and 8 hours for what have you. Especially since most households have two incomes now and not someone to take care of the house and family full time. I don't believe we're going to see anything like that pass through federal legislation anytime soon. Maybe some states could accomplish that. Maybe after this next election, that would be possible. However, I do think that early NRA effort of businesses voluntarily joining and displaying the signs is perhaps a little more achievable. It wouldn't have to be government run. So long as a group has far enough outreach and sets up decent goals, leaving it up to the consumer power would potentially have some sway. Not just another regular boycott in which, frankly, the majority of people don't even know about it. Something that could be achieved, displayed in windows, and explained immediately, leading others to question why businesses chose not to participate or at least support. It doesn't need to be a 32-hour work week either, but we definitely need a few larger companies to have incentive to try that, see how it goes, and I don't know, maybe change some minds. Capitalism is supposed to be controlled by consumer choice after all, so maybe we take back that power and try to do that outside of our normal systems of the government, news, and other ways that clearly aren't working for us anymore. And maybe in the end, we can gain back some of those workers' powers and end up with a little bit of a healthier situation for our daily lives. Which reminds me, don't forget to check out the sponsor for this week's video, Growth Therapy. Just head down to the link in the description below.